action is at the heart of Henkel company and sustainability strategy. Last year, in November 24, we made a big commitment. We committed to become net zero towards 2045. That is a great ambition for Henkel, which calls for a complete transformation of our business along the value chain. I have the pleasure to be today with Ulrike Sapiro, our Chief Sustainability Officer, in order to make sure that we all understand what we mean with this commitment. What is it? What does that mean for Henkel? What do we need to transform in order to make sure that the company will achieve this ambition in the next 2 upcoming decades? Ulrike, welcome. Very happy to have you today in order to go a bit more into the depths of what net zero is and what it means for Henkel. So maybe to get us started, could you explain to us in simple words, and I know it's a big ask, what net zero means and also what it means for Henkel going forward?
That is a good question, and it is a complicated task. I've tried to make it, I thought actually about making it very personal. And we are just after the holiday season, right? So we know we've eaten too much and we need to get a bit on a diet. So we know if we continue eating like we're eating today, we're not going to fit in those trousers by the time it gets warm. And so a bit like this is our carbon budget globally, right? We have been emitting too many greenhouse gases as humanity, as the world, as economy. And we see that we're, filling up the atmosphere with these greenhouse gases, and it's getting very tight and it's getting very warm. So we need to go on a diet. Essentially, we need to go on a carbon diet. And in order to get there, we need to fit into those trousers come May, we have to reduce how much we eat or how much we emit, and to come to a level where what we're expending in a day and the same as what we're eating in a day, and we're in balance. We know how this works. That's our daily life. And the same is for our carbon budget. We need to absolutely reduce how much emissions we generate from greenhouse gases, so CO2 and methane and a number of other difficult things, so that the concentration of those emissions in the atmosphere reduces and over time gets absorbed. So that's what's meant with net zero. And of course, that is a global diet. And we need to break this down. So who has which part of that diet? Countries have part of that carbon diet. Companies have part of that diet. And the rules of that game are determined by standards. And the Science Based Targets Initiative is setting a standard for net zero for companies. And that's essentially what we applied for Henkel to sort of say, okay, what is our carbon diet? And when do we come to a point when we actually fit in those trousers in 2045?
Can I stop you on that? Because I like this diet image, but actually when you go on a diet, what you want is to see fast results, fast outcome. Can you tell us why it takes so long? Because when we started this journey, I remember thinking, wow, we are talking about times we will not even be with the company anymore, most probably. So why does this journey take so long?
Yeah, that is good. We know that quick wins never are sustainable. Then you end up in a yo-yo. So you have to really change fundamentally how you do things. And that's the same with where we are today on our emission reductions. The challenge is that our current economic model, how we're producing things, how we're consuming things, how we are dealing with waste, are super efficient from a financial perspective. But they're not great from a sustainability perspective. But if you're running a really well-working engine and then you want to change direction, that's super hard. So the biggest challenge that we have, frankly, the biggest emissions are coming from the energy that we need. This economic system needs a lot of energy that comes from fossil fuels. Remember, industrialization really kicked off when humans invented or found oil. And so we need to wean ourselves off that and change that energy system into renewables. And that's, of course, more expensive in the beginning. You have to have the technology. You
change your infrastructure as well.
Absolutely. And, this current model had 200 years to develop. We're not going to change that in 2 years. 20 years it seems long, but it's actually, in the big scheme of things, it's not so awful long.
One other topic that is often discussed, and I would even say more and more, is the fact that on this commitment to net zero, and we will come back to the targets that we have for 2045, but also 2030 as a company, so midterm and long term, we as a company have decided to work with SBTi, the Science Based Target Initiative, who is the authority in assessing the quality of the targets of companies. Can you tell us a bit more about this SBTi, who they are, what their role is? Because sometimes we have debates around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, standards are there to give certain rules, and sometimes rules are really uncomfortable. But at least they're creating a level playing field, and everybody does sort of things the same way, which creates credibility, and that's also a value. So the Science Based Target Initiative is an organization that is co-led by not-for-profit organizations, NGOs like the WWF or the Carbon Disclosure Project. So really institutions that carry a lot of knowledge, scientific knowledge around climate and around carbon, and who have, together with stakeholders in a very extensive stakeholder process, developed several generations of standards of how companies should set and calculate their carbon reduction targets. And the latest was around net zero. And of course, these will continue to change, right? They're not set in stone. We learn, we see what functions, we see what new technologies are there. So we expect these things to change. But I think what's important for us is always to be science-based, to not just willy-nilly put out ambitions, but to really know what we're signing up to and what effect it's going to have. And that's why it's been very important for us to work with a science-based target initiative, because then we can say, look, we know this is ultimately going to contribute to our global carbon diet and to manage climate change.
And we want to be able to measure against something which is very solid, as you say, and where the standards can be understood and read by everyone. You said that it's changing a lot and things are not set in stone. And I believe that's one of the challenges when working on sustainability. It's not like you have the book and this is how it is and this is how it will stay for the coming years. So things are very dynamic, they're evolving, the depths of challenges is also getting more, and also the definitions of things are evolving. So that leads me to talking a bit about our targets and how they are defined. And knowing it's sometimes challenging because we've been talking in reference in the past of year 2010, then year 2017, and today with our new targets, we've made the decision to talk about the year 2021 as a base year comparison for future ambition. Can you elaborate a bit on why we have made that decision to have 21 as our base year for our future targets?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, the simple answer would be it's part of the standard to take a base year that is relatively close to where you start, right? Otherwise, you start
too far away in history.
Exactly. But there's another answer, and I think that's what you just mentioned, is we are on a journey and we've already done quite a path on that journey, right? If you remember, Henkel set its first sort of real climate-related energy targets back in 2011, base year 2010 to 2030. The scope of that was really just energy in our operations and to see how do we get more efficient with using energy. It then said the next level was science-based targets to near-term 2030. The first ones with the Science-Based Target Initiative, that was already broader. It included our raw materials and packaging. It had a different sort of aspiration and also ambition level. And now we take the next step. So already we see that we have come quite a long way. And with that, of course, we know better what works and we know better what the real ambition is. And I think the biggest change that we're taking is the following, is actually that we say, it's not about relative reduction anymore. It's not getting a little bit better compared to what you produce, but we say we're going to reduce absolute our greenhouse gas emissions. And in the long term, so not just near term, but long term. So this really reduction, that's why net zero and not just net something percent is a big part of the equation. Secondly, yes, we're changing base year to 2021. That is part of the rules, but it's also enabling better data to measure actually our progress, right? The quality of what we know then is better. And also, let's also not forget, the target is an even bigger scope than we've ever had before, because we need to have our own operations, including our logistics and our fleet and our non-production sites, but also everything that we buy, and partly of what's happening to the end of life of our products is also part of that, which increases the whole scope tremendously. So these are the three main things. Base year is changing, end year and end ambition is changing, and the scopes, the total volume of emissions is also much bigger.
So it's a lot of changes actually, and that's why sometimes it's complex and difficult to follow, and therefore being transparent and communicating very clearly on what is the base year and what are the ambition, mid-term and long-term is absolutely key for us. We spend quite some time working on that with our colleagues from the business, from the adhesive technology business, from the consumer business, from the purchasing organization, the finance organization, putting really our brains together and assessing where we are, assessing what we think would be possible, with still a lot of uncertainty, because I think it's fair to say that there are many things we don't know. We also don't have full visibility on how our suppliers will transform themselves, which is a very important contribution to our own transformation. But that being said, we had the conviction that we need to make that commitment. We need to create for ourselves, for our company, for our employees, this vision of where we want to go. That is in total sync with our purpose, pioneers at heart for the good of generation, and as said in the beginning, with our strategy. Can we remind here the key targets of 2030 and 2045?
Yes. Absolutely, yes, that would be a good thing to also mention. Absolutely. So the way how it works, you are setting targets for the near term. So I should say, not leaving everything to the end, but something near term, so 2030, which is 5 years from now. That is not an awful lot of time. And then when you want to be net zero, and that is for 2045, so that's 20 years. Thing to remember is the volume of emissions is divided up in scopes. Scope 1 and 2, so I'm getting a bit technical. Scope 1 and 2 is essentially your own operations and what you are doing directly in your business. The scope 3 is what you're buying upstream or what is happening downstream. So scope 1 and 2, our near-term target to 2030 is to reduce by 42% compared to where we were in 2021. And our scope 3, so upstream in particular, we're going to reduce by 30% compared to 2021. And all of that together, we get to 90% in 2045, which is to the rules. And then the rest we have to permanently remove, is the word. In short, often it's called offsetting, but it's not quite offsetting, it's really permanent removal of the rest. And that is where the interesting part is, because there's still a lot of discussion and also development of what is the technology for permanent removal in the future. So there are a lot of, exactly to your point, a lot of things that are still evolving. The thing we only know is what we've done in the past and what we know is working, and we have already changed the way how we are sourcing energy for our operations. We've come to now reach more than 90% renewable electricity sources, been a huge shift from where it was in the past. We are also already reduced our CO2 emissions from raw materials and packaging by 17% in the past years. So we know what things are working, but we also know it's not going to be a walk in the park. Because indeed, influencing your suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers to do the same, that's the big
I think what we can proudly say that we did not start last week. No. We started a long time ago at Henkel to drive this transformation, even before this whole topic about long-term commitment on net zero was there. On the other hand, it's also important when you set a long-term target like we did to talk about the short-term or the mid-term, these 2030 ambitions that we have on scope 1 and 2 and scope 3, because you should not leave everything for the end. It would be easy to look at the next decade and say, we're going to do that later. But that would not really work. We all know that. Therefore, the journey has started and the journey needs to be accelerated in the upcoming years. And that means we will see a transformation of our portfolio. We will see a transformation of the way we operate. We will see, hopefully, a transformation of our suppliers, because we need them to also transform the raw materials that we source from them. When we will put all that together, what is your conviction, Ulrike? Do you think that we will manage these ambitions for the short term, the 2030, Do you think we are well on track? How do you see it?
I mean, I wouldn't be a champion and an ambassador for those targets if I believe we would not have an idea of how to do this. Much to the contrary. And we actually expressed pathways of where we think key levers of how we intend to do it collectively as a business in our climate transition plan. Yeah, we didn't just say, let's put a target out there and then meet again in 20 years, but we also put a transition plan there and said, okay, this is how we think it's going to work. And part of that is how we use and source energy ourselves, how we work with our logistics, but the biggest part is how do we design our products and their packaging, as you mentioned, and how do we work with our suppliers and figure out our supply chain to decarbonize there. And that is the biggest game, because 96% of our total emissions are in that upstream supply chain. And we can start by influencing that by really figuring out how can we design our products differently to make them low carbon. And examples are already there. HCB, consumer brands, the concentration of laundry detergents from the big bottle to doing the same wash, number of washes with much less material, it reduces weight, it reduces water, it reduces packaging, it reduces carrying around, and that already reduces CO2 emissions for that one product category or product by 60 or so %. Then you add recycled content to the plastics, and then you make that much more recyclable, that's another one. So there are things and examples we already have that we need to scale and we need to bring to the market. There's another examples is coming from our adhesives business who say, look, let's really understand where the carbon baggage, so to speak, is coming into our products through the suppliers. And let's figure out how we can source differently, how we can work with suppliers to reduce their energy use, how we can be smarter of how we apply those ingredients and reformulate as well, and work with our customers to adapt their processes. So for example, there's a huge commitment to bio-based ingredients, to take the carbon out of the ingredients itself. And there are examples in the hot melt, techno melt world of adhesives that already have bio-based ingredients in the adhesive itself, and then has additional benefits down the road because you can apply it with lower temperatures. So I think what is super important is first thinking end to end, not just doing little things here, thinking end to end. I think how can you really change
the value chain?
And secondly, go for real reduction. And that's the commitment we've made. I think the biggest thing about this commitment is that we say we go for real reduction. And that means, we come back to it, ultimately touching the energy consumption and sources that are required along that value chain to do what we do.
I think it's very important to share, as you just did, concrete examples also out of our portfolio to make this topic very tangible for our employees. We feel there is a wish to contribute, while there is sometimes a difficulty to figure out how to. So it's certainly easier for our colleagues who are working in research and development or product development because it's very close. But we also have a lot of colleagues in companies who are not working directly on product development. What I find extremely positive is that since we did this announcement, I receive a lot of feedback and questions in the different countries and regions. How can we contribute? What can I do? How can I be part of the journey? And that's also the reason why we have decided to do a lot of education sessions, a lot of town hall, a lot of trainings to make sure our employees understand what it means, but also where they can have an active contribution. Speaking about active contribution, it's also valid for our customers and our suppliers. We just discussed it. We know that sustainability is nothing that you do in isolation, and the net zero pathway is no exception here. So that will be certainly a great exercise of collaboration. Can you elaborate shortly on what it took internally in terms of collaboration? Was it difficult? I think I know partly, but I would like to hear you. Did you feel that there were tensions? How did we manage to come to the commitment that we have while having two businesses which are obviously quite different from each other?
Yeah, that is a good question, Sylvie. I'd like to take it perhaps first from the outside in, before I come to was it difficult. I think what we need to, and what we all see in some way, shape or form, is that things are changing, right? We know who we are, we have our purpose, but we also see things are changing. And we had 2024 is the first year that was an average 1.5 degrees warmer than at any time before that. And it is just average, but in some places it's much, much higher than that. And we see in front of our eyes playing out on social media.
Unfortunately, every day, every week, something is happening.
Exactly. So, and that is not just something that you see on screen, this is something that happens to real people. It disrupts supply chains, it disrupts markets, it costs a lot of money. It's estimated that climate-related events have just cost $2 trillion so far. Again, Los Angeles alone, $150 billion in damages. That is a weight on the economy, that is a weight on businesses, that is disrupting supply chains. So there is a certain enlightened self-interest for us to think that this is all about people, our consumers, our employees, ourselves, right? So we as a business realize this will have implications on us, on our markets, and we have an interest in doing something about it. And we see that consumers, employees, shareholders, investors, customers look to us as partners and say, what can you help doing about it in your own operations, but also how can you help us doing stuff? So here, I think we realize that increasingly across the business because it's coming through so many different routes. And in particular, I think as it comes through the customer side, you really feel the requests. And so to answer your question, I don't think we had an awful lot of debate because we know what the problem is and we know we can play a role. And it was more a question of, okay, how sure are we that we can get there and that we are not just making empty promises, but that we can really map out the steps and take the commitments. And I think the discussions we had both on our sort of expert level were fantastic and very constructive. We basically built together a business case that helped all business units and corporate, and I think the same applies for the board. It was not about whether and if, it was more about how do we take this commitment.
How do we get there?
Yeah.
And I think we learned again, like on many topics related to sustainability, the very first thing to do is to be sure we understand each other, we speak the same language, even if we have two very different businesses. And I think we always have to take these topics in the beginning with a lot of humility, starting from assessing the landscape, having this common vocabulary and definitions around the topic in order to make sure that we have exactly, as you said, a very constructive and positive debate about things. I really believe that sustainability is a masterpiece of collaboration. When I observe the teams at Henkel, but also talking with others externally, I said it's a topic where there is nothing where we can succeed in isolation. It's also a topic which is, again, not only about responsibility, but also about potentially business opportunity. Working on net zero will certainly push us to be even more creative, even more innovative, to think about new solutions, as you just described before. And that will be really an opportunity for us as a company to commercialize new solutions, which will be contributing positively. So I really see the topic with a lot of positive mindset. Yes, there will be challenges on the way. There will be certainly moments where we will realize that we had not planned for what is happening, but meanwhile, we develop our resilience, our creativity, and we become a better company. Thank you, Ulrike, for joining today. As always, that was a pleasure, and thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and your expertise on the net zero topic. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.